Hello and welcome to the Lost Decades podcast. This is the first episode. In the podcast, we are going to be breaking down decade by decade history, essentially. We're going to cover essentially all the major events that have happened since 2026 BC. That was the original concept, was we thought it'd be funny to talk about what was going on in 2026 BC or BCE
Yeah,
if you're one of those people. So I'm Austin.
I'm Andrew.
We're going to be your tour guides through history. So we thought it would make the most sense to just start right off in everyone's favorite, Egypt. Andrew, what was going on in Egypt in 2026?
Well, we're in the pretty much the height of the reign of Mentuhotep the second, and he
Rolls
is
off the tongue.
yeah, it really does. Common name these days.
Hmm.
Um, and he was known basically as a great unifier of Egypt at the time, brought them out of the first intermittent period, where Egypt was separated into Upper and Lower Egypt. And he united them in 2040. So by 2026, he's in the middle of his reign.
And he had a pretty long reign, right? So it's like a 50-year reign.
51 years.
I
That's
mean, that's a very respectable number even today to
yeah.
be ruling for 51
And
years.
to be doing it in 2026 BC is crazy.
Yeah. I mean, think about the medical standards back then.
Yeah, and
They
yet he
wasn't that.
lasted. I mean, he was a god.
That's true.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, it was kind of a cool period in Egypt where it's basically the beginning of the Middle Kingdom, right? So
Yes, he's the
there
one
had
who
been
started.
he started it, right. He connected them. So we'd had the intermediate period, which had how that went on for like 100 years or something,
I think it went on for
or
more than that
more than
even.
that.
Yeah.
But one thing I do want to note, because I don't want to just give like the most straightforward like textbook history. Like I do like thinking about the fact that we always think of history as like, okay, now we have the old kingdom, then we have the middle kingdom, and in between there's these intermediate periods that we kind of just skim over where it's like, oh, it was like really confusing and there's all these different countries that are way smaller, but it's like if you're just an average citizen in 2050 BC or whatever, like it's probably almost better to be in an intermediate period. I mean, unless there's a bunch of battles and everyone's fighting all the time, but assuming it's more just you have these little like polities or whatever that are just kind of ruling themselves, like if you're just like a random guy, it might be nice to not have this huge empire that has this like massive military and like has like slaves. And I mean, I'm sure they all have slaves, but it's like in certain ways I think we think negatively on like on these any sort of like intermediate period, but in terms of daily life, I don't know if it would have been too bad.
Well, and it's funny you mentioned that too, because the research I did on Mehetmetep is he kind of set up, I guess, ancient Egypt's version of a police state after he won.
Hmm.
They said one of the first things he did was basically promote a new head of police. Obviously, that wouldn't be the title, but essentially operating as the head of
Hmm.
police and a new jail warden, if you will, in charge of the prison to hold all these new prisoners from the south. And
Right.
apparently, the Egyptians were pretty adept at torture. So you did not want to be on the losing end of that. And if you were not stoked about the new God King ruling, then things were not great for you. But funny
Yeah.
enough, too, if you were on the side of the God King, the side that went, all those taxes and tributaries and slaves ended up going to you, and things were a lot better
Yeah.
for the people of
If
Thebes.
you were a pharaoh, things were going really good.
Well, and the people of Thebes, which where he was ruling
Right.
from, were
Right.
very prosperous. They went through a lot of awesome changes that just made their city a lot better. He
Hmm.
was the one who kind of started the idea of um, essentially a deity being in charge, the guardian deity Amun, which you might have heard of from Amun
Hmm.
Ra, but that comes later.
Right.
Amun is the deity that protects and guards the city of Thebes.
Oh,
also
really?
known as
Wow.
the invisible god. Very interesting. He's the god of wind and air, so you can't see him, but he is
Hmm.
always there. It was just an
I
interesting
forgot
concept.
about that. Yeah, that is interesting because you sort of think of every god as being invisible, but it seems like before that concept, they were really thinking of the gods more as like physical beings. Like you would look at the sun and you're like, oh yeah, that ball of light right there is like Ra, right? Is literally the sun. And so it was way more like literal, like this is the god of a glass of water right here. But then
Yeah,
yeah, oh no, like that is a crazy like thought for someone to have of like, what if there was a god that was invisible and was just like nothing?
always watching
And
out for
then
us.
from then on, it like that idea definitely stuck around.
And
All right, but anything else about Egypt? I mean, there's so much we could
one
get
interesting
into.
thing I thought was he built a Mehetmetep II built a pretty big temple complex that they said it was kind of the first start of not doing pyramids as much. They mostly built pyramid complexes. No, nothing as grand as Gaza or anything, but that was pretty much their bread and butter. And he was the first one to basically start saying, hey, what if we made more of a temple complex with a lot of these walking railways and a lot of these extended roofs and stuff like that? And that kind of took off. Now, the pyramids do come back, but weirdly much later and in a kind of different form. But he was the one to sort of start doing that, which I just thought
That's
was interesting.
cool. So they like
And
went out of style and then they kind of had like a retro like comeback.
pretty much, yeah, not till much later, hundreds of years
Cool.
later in the
It's
New
like
Kingdom.
neoclassical.
Yeah. And the main thing I would talk about, since sticking on the decades, is his son, Mehetmetep III, takes over, and he doesn't do anything that significant other than just trying to stabilize the region, bunch more construction projects, and try to unify the South and the North as one country. Now, granted, they're one country, but try to eliminate the hostilities of the past and say we're all Egyptians here.
That's funny because that reminds me so much of my other podcast that you should check out called Rain Check, The Monarchs of England. Check it out. I record that with me and my mom. But we are going through the Kings of England and the son of King Alfred, who King Alfred connects all the countries of England, or in a certain way, he grows England from the tiny Wessex that it started with. And then when he goes to Edward, Edward kind of like continues that quest and like stabilizes the country and like expands it. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
sure I know tons of kings also do that throughout history, but that just is fresh in my mind. Before we leave Africa, I did want to mention that there is the Kerma culture, which is in modern day Sudan, and it's essentially, from what I can tell on the map, it's like there's Egypt's along the Nile, and then if you keep going down below Egypt, there's the Kerma. I think that area is also called like the Kush, but I get confused because then there's also the Indian Kush. I've never really understood that. I need to look into that more. And then we're going to continue our journey kind of northeast into Asia, more specifically the Middle East. Um, so we've got the third dynasty of Ur, which is a bit of a misnomer because there's no historical evidence of the second dynasty, but people had always called it the third dynasty. So maybe there's a second one in there. But it was seen kind of as like a renaissance of Sumerian culture in Mesopotamia, right?
Yeah, and it was interesting how they kind of got that way because the Akkadians obviously ruled. This is around 2200 BC. The Akkadians were ruling, but sort of lost power, and so southern Sumer region ended up getting not really more autonomy per se, but were like reduced tributes, reduced taxes, reduced need to send things to the king. The king was more of a symbol instead of the actual king per se. And so most of them had a lot more money and manpower to spare, which led to the region becoming much more prosperous.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
So, yeah, real quick, they took over after the Akkadian Empire had collapsed, and I think they had been in power for at least 100 years. I think like 150, 200 years. I know they got started by Sargon of Akkad, who was like this big like conqueror guy, and I feel like he's one of the original guys like that, where you know his name. He's this big figure who like leads this huge army and starts an empire. He's like Genghis Khan or like
Yeah.
Attila the Hun or something, or Napoleon. But um, I love Mesopotamia. We're definitely going to be sticking around, talking more about that for many, many episodes to come. In case you don't know, in case you're kind of new to history, it's in what's now Iraq, basically. It's along the Tigris and Euphrates River, and they call that general area the Fertile Crescent because it kind of goes up between those rivers and then it kind of curves and then goes down like into like where Egypt is. So like that area is just one of the first in the entire world that had civilization and had
Yeah. And one of
city.
the interesting things is the reason we know about so much of what the Kings were doing is they had a interesting like cultural tendency to give the king a new name every year. Um, but the name was more of a title about the things
Hmm.
that he'd done.
Oh,
So,
that's
you
cool.
know, it would be like year two, he built a temple. Year four, he defeated the Akkadians. And so that gives us more idea of what they were doing at the time. And the was interesting
Fun. I
because
like that.
they directly controlled the economy much more than the Acadians did. They focused on essentially having strong governors that were from instead of relying on locals from the region and trying to control it through competence and talent, which is interesting to say, but instead of focusing on endless expansion. Because by previous empires typically expanded and that grew their power base. Um, but in this case, they tried to essentially hunker down and develop. And by doing so, it allowed a lot of the regions to thrive. And what I thought was interesting was reading up on it, there were a lot of smaller towns, I guess we could call them, just small, insignificant regions that started to grow and become more prosperous due to all this trade and stability brought by the And what's interesting is one of those small towns that ended up becoming a focal point of the region, getting very prosperous, was Babylon.
Oh, I've heard that
Yeah.
name before.
Which you will hear about later too when they start to get much more directly involved in government, you could say.
And
Uh,
that's, yeah, that's one way to put it. I love that's one thing I love about how we're starting this far back is I love the idea that we're not even at Babylon yet. Like they're these like future people that don't this futuristic society
It's just
compared
interesting to
to
think that
Earth.
without the Babylon would have probably stayed a backwater. The stability and the trade and economic growth led to that region becoming more important.
No, it kind of makes sense why like regions like this kind of stay as like important places, even though like cities like fall and rise and everything, is that it's like, first of all, like whatever the environment and like climate and everything that like makes it possible. And like I think wheat just like grows naturally there, like super easily is like one reason they were like one of the first farmers. But it's also, yeah, like once one person does it, even if they collapse, now people know about it. They remember the concept and they're like, okay, at some point there was a city and he had this really sick like throne room with all this gold. So like I'm gonna copy that idea, even though I'm like a new civilization or whatever.
Yeah. And to focus on the kings of the time, right now it's we're in the middle of Shushan and then followed by Ibisen, Ibinson, Ibisen. And Shushan was interesting for building massive fortifications between the Tigris and Euphrates to protect the
Mm,
capital and the region in general
gotta
from
build a wall.
gotta build a wall. And again,
Turtle. Got a turtle.
it's funny to think about too. Again, everything's so much more privileged in just the sense that, hey, we should build a wall. Like that'll keep people away. And then it's actually works. People are like, okay, I can't it's just not worth it to
It's like
go.
fuck, there's so much other places to go. I don't need to go on this
There's
wall.
so many cities that don't have walls.
Yeah,
I have to deal with.
right. Yes. So moving along, well, one thing before we leave, they only really survived from 2028 until 2004, right?
That was just that one ruler. So
That one
the
ruler.
focusing on our decades, but the took over in 2112.
Oh
But
wow.
it's
Okay.
so in this time we're looking, and they had five kings. We're looking at the last two because
But when did this collapse in like the
it
Amorites?
collapsed in 2004 BC,
2004. Okay. So it's
and
like George
it
Bush.
kind of was a series of things, like most things are: famine, drought, invasion from the who are a
Right.
nomadic people up in the mountains, kind of coming in and noticing the all the splendor and then the
Mhm.
decline of the kings and the empire,
That is
which
one
led to
thing. Yeah.
essentially in 2004, the reason it's their end is the Amorites come in and literally destroy Ur, the city of Ur, just
Just
wipe it off.
fully. Wow.
And so that's a pretty definitive end, I would say, to that
That'll do it.
dynasty when your city's
Razing it to the
namesake is
ground.
completely destroyed.
And that is one thing I read in a book. I think it was called The Dawn of Everything, but it was talking about how like in this area that would happen a lot where in the lowland areas there'd be like these farmers and they'd grow this wheat and they were on the river and it's like really fertile and stuff, and then there'd always be like people in the mountains that were more like warrior and like a little more like patriarchal and like violent and stuff, and they would like when they would have hard times they would like come down the mountains and they would like do that and they would like destroy the cities, and it would kind of be like a cycle. It's just cool to think about. So we're gonna keep moving east, and we're gonna hit the Indus Valley civilization, which, according to my notes, was kind of at its peak from around 2600 to 2000. So again, a lot of things are kind of collapsing and resetting around this time, around the year 2000. Did you have anything you wanted to add about Indus Valley? There was the Mohenjo-daro, Harappa were the two cities, the biggest ones they
I
had.
didn't have too much about it, but it was interesting that they were some of the first to kind of standardize weights for trading purposes. They had these burnt bricks that were in ratios of one, two, and four to kind of standardize trading, make it easier to prevent corruption and stuff like that. And what's interesting about that is the reason they had to do that, well, they didn't have to, but the reason they focused on something as that was because they were essentially kind of the beginnings of the Silk Road. Now, not as we know it, it's not silk traveling in a lot of goods, but they were the connections from between Mesopotamia and Egypt all the way to China in the east. And they were kind of the ones perpetuating that amount of trade, which led to obviously a more trade focused and standardized kind of economy.
And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the Indus Valley civilization is at least there's a strong theory that um, they were basically the Indo-Europeans that were kind of more in like Central Europe, and then they like spread out all over Europe, and then some of them came down into the Indus Valley, and then that's when they conquered it, and then sort of I think that's when they probably had the started the stratification, because it's like, all right, we're these new people coming in, and so now like to keep us on top, we're gonna like make this kind of whole like social like religious like system where there's like levels of people, and some people like can only be like street cleaners and stuff. And uh,
Hmm.
anyway,
Almost early
I'm fuzzy
caste.
on that, but I do want to make that connection because I want to touch on China, but then that is the same people that are the bell beaker culture that go into Europe, and they're connected with you can tell they're all connected because they have the same pottery that are, I guess, this like bell shape, kind of like whatever bell beaker means, but they're all the same. They had metalworking, and they, I believe, like rode horses, and this is kind of like when that type of like nomadic horse people uh, were like spreading around in Europe and kind of like taking over from the more like hunter gatherer people. They were like um, had animals and they would like farm and things like that. Anyway, um, I didn't want to forget about China though. there was the Longshan culture from 3000 to 1900 BC, and then there's like a semi-mythical dynasty,
Yes, the Xia dynasty. It's
XIA.
yes, and it's interesting because they are considered the first Chinese dynasty. Um, but it's more of a mythical thing. Think when we talk about Hercules and Achilles and stuff in Greece, we're more along those lines where there were definitely civilizations at the time present in that region, but they did not make any strong presence in terms of writing, in terms of buildings, to really know too much about what their culture, religion, or anything was like. So most of what we know is from the second and third dynasties that follow this, that sort of talk back to this time period as more of a legitimizing reason for them. I mean, the
Hmm.
founding of the Shia dynasty is pretty much a guy with superhuman strength who sees that the Yellow River is flooding, and so he personally dredges out a whole bunch of canals to prevent the flooding and help
Yeah.
fertilize the region. And that's why they made him the first emperor. To be fair, they did believe there was emperors before that, but they don't really count them the same as the first Chinese dynasty. And another thing he did, his name was Yu, so he was Emperor Yu, and he passed the throne to his son Qi, QI, um, in his death. And the only reason I'm making that significant is pretty much because that's what all the future dynasties pointed to for this is why we're hereditary. He was such a great
Right.
emperor. He passed it to his son. Before that, they just passed it to whoever was most capable. But we believe this is the best way to do it now because that's how he did it. And he had such a strong dynasty that lasted so long that he must have done it that way.
Well, that's one reason I'm glad we're doing a podcast like this where we're covering the entire planet because there's just so many connections between all this stuff because I've got England on the brain, like I said, and just that whole thing is reminding me of how even there, when like Ethelstan and all those guys, like his dad and grandpa, are conquering England, they are sort of saying like we're reclaiming England from the Vikings. But when you actually think about before the Vikings, when there were the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, like that wasn't England. It was just like there was East Saxony, there was Kent, there was Wessex, there was Mercia. Like they were all Anglo-Saxon, but they didn't really see themselves as like, oh yeah, we're like all connected. Um, so it's similar to this, where even like the earliest dynasties in China had to like pretend essentially that they were a legacy. Like they're throwing it back to like like in order to get legitimacy, it seems like you always have to like refer to like something from the past. You can't just like
Mhm.
make it up. You're like, all right, right now we're making this brand new thing that's never existed. It's like you always have to be like, I'm doing something that someone else did before,
Yeah,
which I just think is funny.
I think it's super interesting.
Um, yeah, so we're definitely going to have a lot more to say about China, obviously, one of the biggest civilizations ever and most ancient. But for now, before we leave the continent of Eurasia, I did mention the Bell Beaker, so they're spreading around Europe. And but if we move more south into the Mediterranean, we've got the early Bronze Age. So again, essentially that's what's happening across the whole world right now is the early Bronze Age. So it's exactly what it sounds like. They're starting to use bronze. And so in the Aegean, we've got basically the Minoan precursors in Crete. Um, so not even the Minoans, who I'm excited to get to, which I know like rode around, like they had a lot of art with bulls on it, and they would like ride bulls, and they were kind of like bullfighters and stuff like that. And I think that's where the myth of the labyrinth comes from that has the Minotaur was like kind of about the Minoans. But
Oh, that's interesting.
so this is the precursors to them.
It's called
And
a
then there's also the Cycladic civilization, um, which I recommend you go and Google. In the future, I might share some images, but for now, we're just gonna leave it to the imagination. But the Cycladic civilization is also in the area of Greece back then, and if you go to the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and I think other museums probably, especially in Greece, have this, but if you look at their art, it just looks really modern. Like it feels kind of like ancient Greek statues and things like that. They're small, but they're so like simple. Like the features are just like really minimalist and just like white. Um, I recommend you look at it. Kind of looks like Atlantis type architecture. Um, Up in Britain, we've got Stonehenge final construction. For some reason, it's putting the dates like 2500 to 2000. So for some reason, Stonehenge was being like edited, was being like changed around for centuries. So I don't know if they were kind of adjusting it to make it like perfectly match up with the stars or what was really going on. But um, important to note, everyone knows about Stonehenge. But I know there's also evidence that there were earlier hinges that were like made out of wood or things like that that wouldn't last as long. So they're a lot harder to find. But um, even though we're over 4,000 years in the past right now, um, there's even stuff going on before this. We got to remember. All right. So we are finally going to touch on our neighbors in the south, land down under, Australia. Um, they're doing their thing. The Aboriginal Australians have been there for about 50,000 years, and they kind of do like controlled burning to control like the farming and all that good stuff. And then up above them in the islands of the Southeast Asia, they're developing their seafaring skills. So they're, I'm assuming, getting used to traveling between the islands, but not quite ready to like brave the actual ocean and go. Like, I don't think anyone's living on Hawaii yet,
No, we're
but
not in Moana times
Moana
yet.
yet.
Yeah, not Moana time.
Yeah, so I'm excited. That'll be really fun to track, like the Polynesians, like making their way to all those islands in Hawaii and all that. And one thing that I do want to note is I think in around 10,000 BC is when the Ice Age is ending. So after that happens, is really when we get the first kind of like civilizations and which we're talking about now. But it wasn't until 2000 BC that I guess all the glaciers from the Ice Age had like fully melted as much as they were going to, and so the sea levels are starting to stabilize. So for the last thousands of years, like probably the islands in Southeast Asia are getting covered in more and more water, and basically sea levels are rising, and we're at the tail end of the Green Sahara. I want to say. I think at this time, Egypt is more humid and has more like greenery than it does now, but I think that's about to end. I'd have to double check that, but I always love thinking about what that would be like to see northern the Sahara Desert with trees and stuff like that.
Yeah.
That'd be cool. Um, all right, so we are going to end it on the note of the continent that we are currently in right now as we record this podcast, the Americas.
Yes.
So, why don't we start with, I think the biggest one at this time by far is Norte Chico, which is in Peru. It's like on the coast of what's now Peru.
Mm-hmm.
And
In the Andes Mountains.
yeah, tell us more about those guys.
Well, so I mean, it's interesting because they were the ones who built what we believe to be the first city in the not United States, in the Americas,
Hmm.
in that same region of Peru. Granted, that was in 3100 BC. But it's interesting to see. And then about 200 years later, they started building more and more. And so when we're approaching the 2026 BC, they're pretty much in full swing. They are still a pre-ceramic culture, which is interesting to think about.
It
Um,
makes you think like how would you even like carry water without a
I think
ceramic?
most of it was just wood. From the research I did, they didn't specifically say that, but they were just saying without ceramics, they'd rely on more natural materials. I can't imagine they were hollowing out rocks just to carry water, maybe to store
Maybe
it.
like straw. You could still use like
Wicker.
plant fibers and stuff.
Yeah. But it's just interesting to think about that during the same time
Definitely,
period,
yeah.
yeah, in
I guess it
America.
is something that like you wouldn't naturally think of like, okay, I'm gonna get a bunch of mud and then I'm gonna like form it into a shape and then heat it up really fast.
Well, and that's one of the downsides of being all alone on their own continent is
Right.
when we go back to, Mesopotamia, Egypt, even stuff like China, the Indus Valley, they have the advantage of humans doing things before, and they can learn that knowledge travels, but that knowledge pretty much stops at the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean and does not go any farther. So
Yeah,
pretty
and
much on their own, no help from anyone else.
right. And I think there's probably a million reasons why it was so different, but I know one of them is because South America especially is so like skinny and tall. It basically the climate changes more, so it's like you can't go east and west as much, which usually have more similar climates. So then it's like as you go south, you're going to end up in such a different environment that like the animals are going to be different and like the clothing you wear and like the food you eat is going to be so different that like you're just not going to travel as much north and south. And then also just like the Amazon rainforest is just like so crazy
Especially
that
thinking back then. There's no development
yeah, like
in that
if
region.
sometimes when I think about the concept of a rainforest, it's like the most terrifying thing ever. Like there's really very few natural environments that you can be like trapped inside of it, you know?
Yeah.
Like when you're in a desert, you're just like there. When you're in on top of a mountain, a valley, all that, like most normal places, you're just kind of in the world. But when you're in even a regular forest, it's kind of like, okay, you can get lost in a forest, but a rainforest, it's just every square inch is covered in some kind of plant or like fungus, and there's just like so much noises and like poisonous animals and snakes and like
And
I don't
especially
know.
with Amazon itself, it goes on forever.
Yeah.
I'm sure the people at the time just thought that was the world, was just this massive forest that covers the whole everything that you can see.
I really do love thinking about that too, of like how that would affect just your whole like perception of things and like the stories you would tell and just everything, where it's like if you grow up in a rainforest, like just what you picture as like this is the world, it's just like, oh my God, there's like a million animals everywhere. Whereas like if you're growing up in like Europe or something, in like Germany, it's just like flat. It's like Kansas or something. You're like, okay, I'm just finding some grass.
There
It's
are a lot
not
of
that
trees out there
exciting.
in Germany specifically, but I get what you're
There are
saying.
mountains, but like France or something like that, where it's just like
Yeah.
grassland. It's like you're gonna picture the world as like flat and like this open sky, and like obviously there's animals and things, but I feel like you would just see things so differently.
Yeah.
Honestly, I don't know why you would live in a rainforest. It sounds terrifying. But I
Oh,
think that's
but
why a lot of people would live on like the coast where you're not really in the rainforest and you probably would just go in there to like hide from your enemies.
yeah, as you get more developed, you move more inward. It seems like you're either by a river or by a coast.
Yeah.
But
No, I'm excited in future episodes. I definitely want to dig more into kind of like talking about just the Americas in general and what could have been going on. But
well, because that's what's interesting about this region. I was gonna say my favorite fact that I learned about this was that they believe that this region, the Norte Chico, was potentially one of the most dense regions at the time. Now we're not talking overall population, but they seem to have a few cities that were just massive and had the most density in the entire world, except for possibly China. Again, we don't have a lot from that region, but China has always been a
mhm.
very populous region, so it's potential that China was more
But
populous.
more than Ur.
Yes, much more dense and more centralized. And they built essentially giant earthworks, big. We could call them pyramids, but we're kind of very primitive step pyramids at the time,
Yeah, some sort
and
of hill like structure.
they're the ones starting work with cotton. It's interesting,
Really?
thinking about how prevalent that is now and how Europe obviously didn't have it until the Americas were discovered. But
Yeah, you gotta remember that like now the Americas, they're the only ones that have tobacco, chocolate, avocados, tomatoes. We've got a lot
Tomatoes,
of good stuff.
peppers,
But we
cotton.
don't, we're missing a lot of the animals. We got a lot of the good food and things like that, but they don't have like cattle, horses, chickens,
Yeah,
pigs. They might have some kind of pig, maybe, but um, definitely lacking on the animal basis, which definitely has a huge impact because it's not just food. It's like not having a pack animal really in the entire continent limits your options.
really
Um,
does.
so there's also, before we wrap things up, there's the Olmec precursor, and I'm excited to get to the Olmec because they have cool these giant heads that you see,
Oh, that's interesting.
which I always like, and they're kind of mysterious. So we're not even at them yet. We're on the precursors to them in Mesoamerica, I guess modern day Mexico, and not too much on North America, but this is around the time when the first people are migrating from the Arctic, or from Alaska into the Arctic and into Canada and Greenland. Essentially, all the cold areas people are starting to move into more because, like I said, like the ice age is fully done. Things have like the temperatures have stabilized, the sea levels have risen, and now it's you can potentially live in Canada, whereas before it would have literally just been like a block of ice. So that's happening. I'm excited to check in on North America because I definitely want to talk about like the Mississippi culture that goes on in the couple centuries.
Well, and that's what's cool
So,
about decade by decade. You'll get to hear us touch
yes.
on all the things that's happening. There's positives and negatives. So the good side is we're going to get through pretty much everything. The
Hmm.
downside is certain regions you'll hear us just either
Focus
briefly
on.
mention or just basically say, the same thing's kind of happening purely just based on information that's available. There's not a lot known about some of these regions. So it's very
Hmm.
broad where they'll say for 1,000 years they were doing this, which means we're going to have several episodes of, well,
This is
they're
still
kind of just
happening.
doing the same thing they were doing before.
Yeah, so I hope you liked this episode, but I would predict that future episodes might be slightly shorter just because we won't have so much to kind of give like context for, and we can just jump right in, and kind of give updates. For this episode, we went from essentially 2026 BC, let's say, to 2000. I think it's our first episode. Who knows what'll end up evolving out of it, but I think the plan is next episode, maybe we'll do a couple decades. We'll go from like 2000 to like 1970 or something like that.
We'll do the research on all the cool things going on and stick to
And
what's
we'll decide. We'll decide. Yeah. I think.
we'll decide how much time we need to cover.
Right. So essentially, if there's an episode where we only cover one decade, you know it's going to be a banger because that means there's a lot to talk about. And then maybe sometimes we'll be like, this episode we're covering 10 decades, aka a century, because we do want to move it at a good pace because we did the math and episode 100, if we did one decade an episode 100 would get us to basically the year 1000 BC in
Yeah.
2 years. So we don't want to move quite that slow, but we also don't want to rush it. We want to luxuriate. We want to,
We
uh,
want you to learn the major players, get used to some guys, you know, have some fun with people, see what their dynasties lead to.
and I think it'll be fun because then by the end of this whole journey, if assuming we make it to the current 2026 AD, it'll be fun to look back and we literally have gone through essentially all of recorded history in one
Yeah.
podcast.
And we
So
do have a
join
cool
us
map.
on this crazy journey.
Yes, thank you.
Um, we should be releasing episodes weekly, probably on Wednesdays or Thursday morning, something like that. Um, we don't have an Instagram yet, but I'll get that going and other social media. Check us out, leave a review, give us 5 stars, all that stuff. Share it with your friends. Tell your mom, tell your
Like and
dad. Don't tell your grandma, but you can tell your grandpa
yeah.
and your aunt. What do you think about uncles? Should they tell their uncle?
Mm,
If he's cool.
he's Unk. So
If he's cool. We're all unk. Okay. All right, thanks for joining. That was the Lost Decades podcast. See you next time.
See you next time.